Have you ever wondered how new words get created and who invents them? Well, so did Nick Allen, the main character in the book Frindle by Andrew Clements. Nick is a fifth grader at Lincoln Elementary School, which is located in a small town in New Hampshire. He has always been known by his friends and classmates as the kid who liked to pull pranks and play jokes and make everyone laugh. His teachers in the past have always gone along with this and thought he was very funny. But this all ends when he enters the fifth grade with Mrs. Granger, the language arts teacher. Mrs. Granger was well known as the very strict teacher with piercing eyes and who loved learning about and teaching new vocabulary words. She even asked every parent to make sure they had a dictionary at home for the students to use. Now, another thing to know about Nick is that he was the best at wasting time. He knew exactly what questions to ask teachers in order to get them off track and forget to assign homework for the day. He tried to do this with Mrs. Granger on the first day of school, but it did not go as he had planned. With just a few minutes left in the school day, he asked his teacher where new words come from and what they mean. She answered by saying that words mean what they mean because we say they do. Then she asked Nick to do research on this topic and give a report the next day in class. So that night, Nick used his dictionary to discover something very interesting. The part of the dictionary about the origins of words said that many people everywhere around the world have contributed the words in the dictionary. The next day, Nick presented his report to the class and Mrs. Granger really enjoyed it. While Nick and his friend Janet were walking home from school that day, he found a pen on the ground. Nick had remembered that Mrs. Granger said that words mean what they mean because we say they do. And at that moment, Nick decided that he wanted to create a new word, and he decided to call the pen a frindle. Now, over the next few days, Nick introduced this new word to all of his friends. They went into the store and told the clerk that they wanted to buy a frindle. They began to use the word frindle in school, and they vowed to never use the word pen again. On the first day that they used the new word at school, Mrs. Granger was not pleased. She told Nick that it was silly to replace a word that had been around for a very long time with a new nonsense word. But Nick did not agree with her, and he said they weren't doing anything wrong by using this new word. Now, after a few days of the word frindle being used by the whole class, Mrs. Granger did something that Nick thought was very strange. She told Nick that she had a letter for him, but she would not give it to him until all of this frindle business was over and done with, and she had him sign the envelope that the letter was in. After a few weeks had gone by, the whole school was now using the new word in place of the word pen. And Mrs. Granger and the other teachers became very frustrated and angry about this, and they forbid the word to be used by anyone anymore. And Mrs. Granger decided that as a punishment, she would keep any student after school who used the word frindle in place of pen. Use of the word kept spreading throughout the entire town, and up to 200 students were being kept after school. Some parents even began to call to complain about this, and eventually the principal had a talk with Nick and his parents. But Nick's parents stood up for him and agreed that he was not being disrespectful or doing anything wrong by using the word frindle. As the word became very well established and used by everyone in daily conversations, a local newspaper reporter caught wind of this. Judy Morgan visited the school in order to investigate the story further. She spoke to the principal and Mrs. Granger and some students. The next day, she received a package in the mail from Nick. It contained their class picture in which every student was holding up a pen and saying the word frindle. The reporter decided to make the story front page news. The story grew even bigger and eventually arrived at the national level. Nick became sort of a celebrity, and he was on talk shows and interviewed for magazines and even on national news broadcasts. The whole country was now using the word frindle. Another person who loved this word was Bud Lawrence. Bud lived in Nick's town and was friends with his dad. He had a great idea to trademark Nick's new word. He began making any and every kind of product with the word frindle on it. This included t-shirts, hats, sunglasses, and notebook paper, and he couldn't keep up with all the orders that he was receiving. Eventually, his business even spread to other countries throughout the world. He eventually asked Nick's dad to sign the contracts to trademark the word, and Bud told him that Nick would receive a portion of the profits from the product sales. But Nick's dad didn't tell him about this money, and instead, he set up a trust fund account for Nick that all the money would go into. Now, over the next several months, the fuss over the word had died down, and eventually it was used as any other word was. Nick realized that Frindle was no longer his word, and that it belonged to everyone. This changed Nick's personality, and he was no longer that funny, joking kid that everyone had known. And as fifth grade drew to an end, Nick told Mrs. Granger goodbye, and he returned to his old self over the summer and throughout the rest of his school years. 10 years later, when Nick was a junior in college, he turned 21 and received his trust fund. He was very, very rich. One day he received a package in the mail, and in it was an envelope and a brand new edition of Webster's College Dictionary with a note on the front. And the note instructed him to turn to a certain page, and on that page, Nick found the word Frindle. In the envelope he received, he found the letter that Mrs. Granger had written to him when he was in the 5th grade. In the letter, she revealed that the whole time she had been rooting for the word Frindle to succeed and eventually make it into the dictionary. She had also sent him her favorite pen that she used every day when she was his teacher, and under the cap of the pen was a little piece of paper with the word Frindle on it. Finally, about a month later, Mrs. Granger received a package in the mail. It contained a letter from the superintendent stating that a trust fund for college scholarships had been established by one of her former students. The scholarship fund was $1 million. Also in the package was a Christmas card with a note that Nick had written when he was in her class. The note said that she is one of his favorite teachers and that there was something he wanted her to have. Mrs. Granger opened the box she had received, and inside was the gold fountain pen that Nick had found on the ground on his way home from school that day in the 5th grade. Now I'm going to read a passage from the book Frindle. 3 things happened later that same afternoon. Nick and Janet Fisk had missed the bus because of a school newspaper meeting, so they walked home together. They were seeing who could walk along the curb without falling. It took a lot of concentration, and when Janet stepped off into the street, Nick said, "That's 3 points for me." But Janet said, "I didn't fall, I saw something. Look." She bent down and picked up a gold ballpoint pen, the fancy kind. That was the first thing, Janet finding the pen. They got back on the curb, and Nick followed Janet, putting one foot carefully in front of the other on the narrow concrete curb. And while he stepped along, he thought back over the school day, especially about his report, and what Mrs. Granger had said about words at the end of the period had finally sank in. That was the second thing, understanding what Mrs. Granger had said. She had said, "Who says dog means dog? You do, Nicholas." "You do, Nicholas," he repeated to himself. "I do," Nick thought, still putting one foot in front of the other, following Janet. "What does that mean?" And then Nick remembered something. When he was about 2 years old, his mom had bought him one of those unbreakable cassette players and a bunch of sing-along tapes. He had loved them and played them over and over and over. He would carry the tape and the player to his mother or his big brother or father and bang them together and say, "Guagala, guagala, guagala," until someone put the cassette in the machine and turned it on. And for 3 years, whenever he said guagala, his family knew that he wanted to hear those pretty sounds made with voices and instruments. Then, when Nick went to preschool, he learned that if he wanted his teacher and the other kids to understand him, he had to use the word music. But guagala meant that nice sound to Nick because Nick said so. "Who says guagala means music?" "You do, Nicholas." "No fear," yelled Janet. They were at the corner of their own street, and Nick had bumped into her, completely absorbed in his thoughts. Janet stumbled off the curb, and the gold pen in her hand clattered onto the street. "Sorry, I didn't mean to. Honest," said Nick. "I was just watching. I just wasn't watching." "Here." Nick stooped over and picked up the pen and held it out to her. "Here's your—" And that's when the third thing happened. Nick didn't say pen. Instead, he said, "Here's your Frindle." And that's my book chat for the book Frindle, and thank you all for watching.